officers to meet these families at the earliest possible opportunity to discuss with them the options for the form the inquiry should take. And it was clear their wishes were for a statutory inquiry with the power to compel witnesses to give evidence under oath. And that's why I am confirming this to the House today. This inquiry will examine the case's wider circumstances, including the Trust's response to clinicians who raised the alarm and the conduct of the wider NHS and its regulators. And I can confirm to the House that Lady Justice Thirlwell will lead this inquiry. She is one of the country's most senior judges, currently sitting in the Court of Appeal, and with many years of experience as a senior judge and a senior barrister before that. Before making this statement, I informed the victim families of her appointment, which was made following conversations with the Lord Chief Justice, the Lord Chancellor, and the Attorney General. I have raised with Lady Justice Thirlwell that the family should work with her to shape the terms of reference. We hope to finalise these in the next couple of weeks so the inquiry can start the consultation as soon as possible. I have also discussed with Lady Justice Thirlwell the family's desire for the inquiry to take place in phases, so it provides answers to vital questions as soon as possible. I will update the House when these terms of reference are agreed and continue to engage with the families. Today, Mr. Speaker, I would also like to update the House on actions already taken to improve patient safety and identify warning signs more quickly, as well as action already underway to strengthen this further. First, in 2018, NHS England appointed Dr. Aidan Fowler as the first National Director of Patient Safety. He worked with the NHS to publish their first patient safety strategy in 2019, creating several national programmes, including requiring NHS organisations to employ dedicated patient safety specialists, ensuring all staff receive robust patient safety training, and using data to quickly recognise risks to patient safety. Last summer, to enhance patient safety further, I appointed Dr. Henrietta Hughes, a practising GP, as England's first Patient Safety Commissioner for Medicines and Medical Devices. Dr. Hughes brings leaders together to amplify patients' concerns throughout the health system. Second, in 2019, the NHS began introducing medical examiners across England and Wales to independently scrutinise deaths not investigated by a coroner. These senior doctors also reached out to bereaved families and find out if they have any concerns. All acute trusts have appointed medical examiners who now scrutinise hospital deaths and raise any concerns they have with the appropriate authorities. Third, in 2016, the NHS introduced Freedom to Speak Up guardians to assist staff that want to speak up about their concerns. More than 900 local guardians now cover every NHS trust. Fourth, in 2018, Tom Clark KC was commissioned to make recommendations on the fit and proper person test for NHS board members. NHS England incorporated his review into the fit and proper person test framework published last month. This introduced additional background checks, consistent Get It Right First Time programme, expanded its cover to neonatal services. They reviewed England's neonatal services using detailed data and gave trusts individual improvement plans which they're working towards. Indeed, Professor Tim Briggs, who leads the NHS Get It Right First Time programme, has confirmed that all neonatal units have been reviewed by his programme since 2021. Let me now turn, Mr. Speaker, to our forward-facing work. We have already committed to moving medical examiners to a statutory basis and will table secondary legislation on this very shortly. This will ensure deaths not reviewed by a coroner or investigated in all medical settings, in particular extending coverage in primary care. And this will enter into force in April. Second, on the Clark review. At the time, the NHS actively considered Clark's recommendation 5 on disbarring senior managers, taking the view that introducing the wider changes he recommended in his review mitigated the need to accept this specific recommendation on disbarring. This point was also considered further by the Messenger review. In light of the evidence from Chester and ongoing variation in performance across trusts, I have asked NHS England to work with my department to revisit this. They will do so alongside the actions recommended by General Sir Gordon Messenger's review of leadership, on which the government has already accepted all 7 recommendations from the report dated June last year. This will ensure the right standards, support and training are in place for the public to have confidence that NHS boards have the skills and experience needed to provide safe, quality care. Third, by January, all trusts will have adopted a strengthened freedom to speak up policy. This national model policy will bring consistency to freedom to speak up across organisations providing NHS services, supporting staff to feel more confident to speak up and raise any concerns. I have asked NHS England to review the guidance that permits board members to be freedom to speak up guardians, to ensure these roles provide independent challenge to boards. Fourth, the Get It Right First Time programme team will launch a centralised and regularly updated data set to monitor the safety and quality of national neonatal services. Finally, we are exploring introducing Martha's Rule to the UK. Martha's Rule would be similar to Queensland's system called Ryan's Rule. It's a 3-step process that allows patients or their families to review a clinical review of their case from a doctor or nurse if their condition is deteriorating or not improving as expected. Ryan's Rule has saved lives in Queensland, and I've asked my department and the NHS to look into whether similar measures could improve patient safety here in the UK. Mr. Speaker, I also want to take this first opportunity of the return of the House to provide an update on the Essex Statutory inquiry. In June, I told the House the inquiry into NHS mental health in patient facilities across Essex would move forwards on a statutory footing. And today I can announce Baroness Lampard, who led the Department of Health's inquiry into the crimes of Jimmy Samuel, has agreed to chair the statutory inquiry. I know Baroness Kate Lampard will wish to engage with members of this House and the families impacted, and following their input, I will update the House on the terms of reference at the earliest opportunity. Mr. Speaker, the crimes of Lucy Letby were some of the very worst the United Kingdom has witnessed. I know that nothing can come close to righting the wrongs of the past, but I hope that Lady Justice Thirlwell's inquiry will go at least some way towards giving the victims' families the answers they deserve. My department and I are committed to putting in place robust safeguards to protect patient safety and to make sure the lessons from this horrendous case are fully learned. I commend this statement to the House.
I now call the Shadow Secretary of State, Wes Streeting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I strongly echo the sentiments of the Secretary of State and thank him for advance sight of his statement. I'd also like to welcome the appointment of Lady Justice Thirlwell to lead the inquiry in the case of the crimes committed by Lucy Letby, and I also strongly welcome his appointment today too of Baroness Lampard to lead the statutory review in Essex, and look forward to receiving further updates from him as soon as possible. Turning to the case of Lucy Letby, there are simply no words to describe the evil of the crimes that she committed. They are impossible to fathom. And though she has now been convicted and sentenced to a whole life order, the truth is there is no punishment that could possibly fit the severity of the crimes that she has committed. With Chester Police's investigation now having expanded to cover her entire clinical career, we may not yet know the extent of her crimes. What we do know is her victims should be starting a new term of school today. Our thoughts are with the families who have suffered the worst of traumas, whose pain and suffering we couldn't possibly imagine, who will never forget the children cruelly taken from them. We hope that the sentencing helped bring some closure, even though the cowardly killer dared not face them in court. I want to pay tribute to the heroes of this story, the doctors who fought to sound the alarm in the face of hard-headed, stubborn refusal. While this murderer should have been stopped months before she was finally suspended, were it not for the persistent courage of the staff who finally forced the hospital to call in Cheshire Police, more babies would have been put at risk. I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in recognising Dr. Stephen Barclay and Dr. Ravi Jayaram, whose bravery has almost certainly saved lives. Blowing the whistle on wrongdoing is never easy, and that's why it should not be taken lightly. Indeed, you can judge the health of an institution by the way it treats its whistleblowers. The refusal to listen, to approach the unexplained deaths of infants with an open mind, to properly investigate when the evidence appears to be so clear, is simply unforgivable. The insult of ordering concerned medics to write letters of apology to this serial killer demonstrates the total lack of seriousness with which their allegations were treated. Can I welcome the fact that the Secretary of State has changed the terms of the inquiry and put it on a statutory footing? There must be no hiding place for those responsible for such serious shortcomings. It is welcome that the inquiry will have the full force of the law behind it as it seeks to paint the full picture of what went wrong at the Countess of Chester Hospital. And it is right that the wishes of the families affected have been listened to, and I welcome the fact that they're going to be involved in the drawing up of the terms of reference. I asked the Secretary of State, and in fact people right across government and people who hope to be in government in the future, to make sure that in future families and victims are consulted at the outset in awful cases like this and others like it. And can he assure the House that the families will continue to be involved in decisions as the inquiry undertakes its work? Mr. Speaker, no stone can be left unturned in the search for the lessons that must be learned, but it is already clear that there were deep issues with the culture and leadership of the Countess of Chester Hospital. And this is not the first time that whistleblowers working in the NHS have been ignored when listening to their warnings could have saved lives. Despite several reviews, there is no one who thinks the system of accountability, professional standards, and regulation of NHS managers and leaders is good enough. Why were senior leaders at the Countess of Chester Hospital still employed in senior positions in the NHS right up to the point that Lucy Letby was found guilty of murder? The absence of serious regulation means a revolving door of individuals with a record of poor performance or misconduct can continue to work in the health service. Does the Secretary of State agree that this is simply unacceptable in a public service which takes people's lives into its hands? The lack of consistent standards is also hampering efforts to improve the quality of management. I'm sure the Secretary of State will agree with me that good management is absolutely vital for staff well-being, clinical outcomes, efficient services, and most of all, patient safety. The case for change has been made before. Sir Robert Francis, who led the inquiry into the deaths at Mid-Staffs, argued in 2017 that NHS managers should be subject to professional regulation. In 2019, the Clark Review, commissioned by the Secretary of State, called for a regulator to maintain a register of NHS executives with the power to disbar managers for serious misconduct. In 2022, the Messenger Review, commissioned by the Right Honourable Member for Bromsgrove, recommended a single set of core leadership and management standards for managers, with training and development provided to help them meet those standards. We must act to prevent further tragedies. So I welcome his announcement that his department is reconsidering Clark's recommendation 5. Labour is calling for the disbarring of senior managers found guilty of serious misconduct, so I can guarantee him our support if he brings that proposal forward. He should also go further. Will the Secretary of State now begin the process of bringing in a regulatory system for NHS management alongside standards and quality training? Surely we owe it to the families and the staff who were let down by a leadership team at the Countess of Chester Hospital that was simply not fit for purpose. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I know I speak for the whole House when I say that the parents of child A, child C, child D, child E, child G, child I, child O, and child P are constantly in our thoughts, as are the many other families who worry whether their children have also been victims of Lucy Letby. We owe it to them to do what we can to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. And as the government seeks to do that, they will have our full support.
Well, firstly, Mr. Speaker, can I thank the honourable gentleman both for the content of his response and the manner in which he delivered it. And I think it underscores the unity of this House in our condemnation of these crimes and our focus on putting the families central to getting answers to the questions that arise from this case. I join him in paying tribute to those consultants who spoke up to trigger the police investigation and to prevent further harm to babies. And I note the further work that the police are doing in this case, and also pay tribute to the police team that I had the privilege of meeting, who again have worked incredibly hard in very difficult circumstances in the course of this investigation. As he said in his response, the families are absolutely central to the approach that we're taking, and that's why I felt it was very important to discuss with them the relative merits of different types of statutory inquiry. But their response was very clear in terms of their preference for a statutory inquiry, and I have certainly surfaced to Lord Justice Thirlwell some of the comments from the family in terms of the potential perhaps to phase that, but of course these will be issues for the judge to determine. In terms of his concerns around the revolving door, there are clearly a number of measures that have already been taken, but I share his desire to ensure that there is accountability for decisions, and indeed members of the House will know that in past roles I have been particularly vocal around making points in that regard, and I think again that is central to many of the questions that the families have in terms of the wider regulation within the NHS. He mentioned the importance of good management, and I'm extremely interested through this review and also the steps we can take ahead of the review as to how we put further support into managers within the NHS and also into non-exec directors. Indeed, the government accepted in full the 7 recommendations of the Messenger review. The CART review was largely accepted. There was the issue of recommendation 5, and that is why it's right that we look again at that in the light of the further evidence. So it is clear a significant amount of work has already gone in. There are a number of figures, including Aidan Fowler, Henrietta Hughes, focused particularly on safeguarding patient safety. But we need to, in the wake of this case, look again at where we can go further. The inquiry will do that with the full weight of the law and the statutory inquiry, but I'm also keen we look at what further quicker measures can be taken, and indeed have been in regular contact with the NHS England to take that work forward.
Chairman of the Select Committee, Steve Barclay.
Mr. Speaker, could I just place on record my sympathies with the families who conducted themselves with the utmost dignity throughout this process, and they obviously remain in my thoughts and prayers as well. Can I welcome the judge-led statutory inquiry that my right honourable friend has announced? It's the right thing to do, as is the phases of the inquiry, which prevents stuff taking too long to move fast. As that work moves forward and debate rightly continues to touch on how we regulate managers working in the NHS and remove them, can I just ask that ministers remain alert to any us and them thinking between managers and clinicians, because surely any successful hospital trust is one team working together so that defensive medicine is all but impossible.
Yes, very good.
Secretary of State.
Well, I very much agree with the Chair of the House Select Committee in terms of the need for a one-team approach, and indeed for us to look at how we encourage more clinicians into management roles itself. I think we need to be clear-eyed on the fact that often some of those in management positions were already regulated because they were in medical or nursing sort of regulatory positions. But it is important that we look at what is the right approach to ensure that there is accountability for families, and that is why NHS England will look at this further.
Samantha Dixon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Terrible crimes have been committed in the Countess of Chester Hospital in my constituency, my hospital. I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for meeting and listening to the families at the heart of this tragic case and for instituting a statutory inquiry into the circumstances surrounding these crimes. Serious questions about NHS accountability and governance have arisen, which the inquiry will need to address. Given the scope of Cheshire Police's Operation Hummingbird has now broadened, what reassurance can the Secretary of State offer my community about our hospital?
Secretary of State.
Well, first, could I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady for the work that she has done working with families and staff in response to these terrible events. It is important that we both reassure patients that are using the Countess of Chester now in terms of the measures that have been put in place, and that's why I wanted, particularly in my statement, to bring to the House's attention the steps that have already been taken. And what was also striking about my discussion with family members was they were at pains to point out that some of the staff that they had been treated by in the Countess of Chester, how those staff had been exceptional in their care. There were specific issues that which raised very serious concerns, but they were also at pains to point out that there were other staff that had treated them extremely well. And indeed, as the Shadow Health Secretary said, there were staff also raising concerns and ensuring that the police investigated. Obviously, with NHS England colleagues, we are working closely with the Countess of Chester in terms of next steps, but it is important that the measures we've taken provide reassurance in terms of the quality of care that is available at Chester now.
Andy Carter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I commend the Secretary of State for his decision to upgrade the inquiry and put it on a statutory footing, something that I know many of the families wanted. I'm keen to understand what steps my right honourable friend can take to give assurances that there is a consistency in all hospitals around the UK around the freedom to speak up guardians. What steps is he taking to ensure that that is consistent right across the NHS estate?
Secretary of State.
Well, I think he raises an extremely important point, and that is why in 2022 the guidance around the National Freedom to Speak Up policy was strengthened. I mentioned the appointment in September 2022 of Henrietta Hughes as the Patient Safety Commissioner. It's also why significant work has been done on the quality of data, looking at the work, for example, of the Get It Right First Time team, so that the data can be examined more effectively to alert investigation. But there are further lessons, looking at the timeline around, for example, the Royal College report and who had visibility of that and when. So clearly there are further lessons that we need to look at. But already the guidance, particularly around freedom to speak up, has been strengthened. And indeed, back in 2018, the Public Interest Disclosure Act was also strengthened. And alongside that, the same year, the Child Death Overview Panel, which reviews all child deaths, was also strengthened.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Secretary of State will be aware, my constituency is served by the Countess of Chester Hospital. Many of my constituents work there and indeed have been treated there. There's no doubting the impact this has had on the whole community, as my honourable friend has mentioned. But as a constituency MP, when I was briefed by the management at the time these issues first emerged, I can say that there was a very different picture painted to the one that we are seeing today. And it has been a huge concern that management involved at the time have gone on to work in other parts of the NHS, seemingly with approval from NHS England. So I hope the Secretary of State is going to look into that, and I hope that finally the CARC review recommendations will be implemented, because I think there are serious lessons to be learned from what went on with the senior management there.
Secretary of State.
He raises an extremely important point, and it is right that we focus on this and ensure that the concerns around the revolving door are addressed. In terms of the decision taken by my predecessor, my understanding is the recommendations accepted in CARC were viewed as being effective in addressing that, which are obviously events since the events in terms of this statement. But what I've asked the NHSC colleagues in the department to look at again is just to test that further in light of the evidence that has come through the court case in particular.
Priti Patel.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My heartfelt prayers and thoughts are rightly with those families whose heartbreak and suffering is just unimaginable, and I really do welcome the tone that the Secretary of State has taken today, really to make sure that no stone is unturned in their quest for justice. Likewise, I'd like to really thank him for the support that he's given us in Essex with the Essex Mental Health Trust statutory inquiry that he announced just before recess. We look forward to working with Baroness Lampard on the terms of reference, but also could he please, I think today from the floor of the House, give some assurance to the 80+ families who simply did not engage with the inquiry previously, so that they can come forward and give evidence and have confidence that their evidence will actually lead to the justice that they're now seeking for the loved ones that they are now missing through what has happened back at the Mental Health Trust.
Well, I'm very keen to give my right honourable friend that assurance. I know she has personally championed, as indeed a number of colleagues across the House have, but she has personally championed the interests of families in Essex to ensure that they get the answers that they need. Indeed, she made the points very effectively to me in terms of the concerns with the inquiry hitherto in Essex. And our focus, and I think the area of consensus across the House, is our focus has to be on ensuring that families get the answers that they legitimately deserve. The reason, therefore, that it was proportionate to shift the Essex inquiry from a non-statutory to statutory footing was the concern of the chair that there was insufficient engagement, particularly from staff, but also, as she has just said, from families who did not have confidence in the inquiry as it was then. And that is why that inquiry has been strengthened in response to that. It's why we put in a very senior chair with experience of the Savile inquiry, and I know that my right honourable friend will be at the forefront of ensuring that the families' voices are heard moving forward.
Mike Amesbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I and my constituents of Cheshire West and Chester that are served by the Countess certainly welcome the fact this inquiry has now been put on a statutory footing, but like other honourable members across the House, and in particular those families and victims of this horrendous situation. We want to ensure that those managers that seem to have somehow managed to recycle themselves into leadership positions face stronger regulation and accountability, and I look forward to the Secretary of State expanding upon that.
Secretary of State.
Well, it will not surprise the honourable gentleman that this was a central concern of the families when I met them, in terms of the questions of the extent to which they felt fobbed off when concerns were raised, as well as the ability of those managers to continue either in post or to move to new posts. And I think that is a concern shared across the House. It is very much central to some of the safeguards that have been put in place in terms of the recommendations from CARC that have already been accepted. I think it also opens up questions in terms of the role of boards and how we strengthen non-exec directors and the training and the induction and the other provisions that we can put in place. But of course, some of these issues are why we're having the inquiry and through the statutory process, there will be the opportunity for people to be called to give evidence and for the judge-led inquiry to be putting those questions on behalf of the families.
Mary Robinson.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for this statement and for the announcement of the judge-led inquiry. These shocking murders of these babies and the attempted murders of so many others have really shocked the nation. One of the concerns for me coming out of this, a major concern for me, was to hear that managers had ignored those consultants who had raised some really serious issues. And there is a culture, it appears, within some hospitals where people are not listened to still when they raise concerns. Dr. Stephen Barclay, one of the whistleblowers in this case, says he's been inundated with emails from people who are saying that they haven't been listened to when they've spoken about really serious issues. In the light of this case, and thank you for everything that the Minister has said today, would he support a strengthening of the whistleblower whistleblowing legislation so that all whistleblowers can know that they will be heard and protected?
Secretary of State.
To provide some reassurance to the Honourable Lady, the Public Interest Disclosure Act was strengthened in 2018. Obviously, that is post the appalling events covered today, but the Public Interest Disclosure Act has already been strengthened. The Freedom to Speak Up Guardians has also been both implemented since these events, but strengthened further in the guidance. And also significant work has been done in terms of the role of the Child Death Overview Panel, the role of data in terms of the Get It Right First Time team, in terms of picking up data where there is concern. So significant amount of work has been done on that. But of course, through the inquiry, we also need to interrogate more clearly why the concerns raised by clinicians were not acted on by those in leadership positions, and I'm sure that is something that the judge will want to test in significant detail.
Mark Tarney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I certainly welcome the Secretary of State's change of heart on the statutory inquiry. I think that is vital to get the answers that all the parents deserve. It is also vital that any other parents who have concerns about the treatment of their child when Letby was working at Chester and Liverpool have those concerns fully investigated or re-investigated by the police. So will he ensure that the Home Secretary provides whatever resources the police need to make this happen?
State.
I think given the gravity, the seriousness of the cases before the House today, I know it is something that I think all ministers are very seized of, but I will of course relay the point that he's raised with my right honourable friend. But I know talking to the team there, that is something that specific funding had been allocated for in response to the serious of this, but of course I'll relay the point to the Home Secretary.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's impossible to imagine the depths of the grief of the families of the babies who were murdered, and it's absolutely right that we try to help them get the truth, to find out the facts, and to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So thank you for agreeing the statutory inquiry today and making sure that parents are involved. In the Essex case, 2,000 people lost their lives, and families have waited many years for that truth. So can I thank the Secretary of State for progressing with the statutory inquiry and for announcing the new lead of that inquiry today. But can he also put that same energy into saying the families will be involved in the terms of reference, that those terms of reference will be agreed swiftly, and that that inquiry will have the resources they need to get to the truth too?
Secretary of State.
Well, again, my right honourable friend raises an extremely important point, and I am extremely keen that the families, as well as the members of Parliament in Essex, are able to engage with the chair of that inquiry and to shape that. As part of the discussion in Chester with families around the relative merits of a statutory and a non-statutory inquiry, part of the concern is sometimes the statutory inquiry takes much longer, which is why the point around phasing is important. Of course, the court case itself will have established significant areas of factual information that can be used within that inquiry. I hope she can see from the decision to put the Essex inquiry onto a statutory footing that underscores our commitment to getting families the answers that they need.
Tim Farron.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My prayers remain with the families who live each day with the consequences of this unspeakable evil. Amongst the most chilling aspects of this tragic outrage was, as we've heard, the actions of trust leaders and managers who ignored warnings and belittled whistleblowers. And we have to ask ourselves how many lives could have been saved if people had been believed sooner. I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, this feels horrifically similar to the failings in maternity services in my own local trust of Morecambe Bay during the 2000s, where we saw several mothers and babies needlessly lose their lives. Since then, despite the freedom to speak up at measures that have been instituted across the country, I still see in trusts in the North West whistleblowers in other departments marginalised, bullied unfairly treated, having their careers trashed, all because it would appear there is a culture of defending the reputation of institutions rather than protecting the safety of patients. So what confidence will he give to potential future whistleblowers that when they, in order to save lives, speak out, they will not then be singled out?
Secretary of State.
Well, again, and I think colleagues across the House know that in terms of protecting whistleblowers, including whistleblowers in the NHS, that is something that I have long championed. And the guidance, as I said earlier in the statement, has been strengthened. But I think one of the best mitigants is actually having much more transparency on the data, because I think the more transparent the data is, the more difficult it is for concerns to be ignored. So I think there's a number of issues. We've strengthened the data. We have the role of Freedom to Speak Up Guardians. We need to look at the fact that in Chester, if a Freedom to Speak Up Guardian was on the board, is that the right approach? Do we need to look at whether these roles are on the board or not? But significant work has already been done since these events and since Morecambe to strengthen the safeguards around speaking up and the Public Interest Disclosure Act. But I think alongside that, having organisations like the Get It Right First Time team looking at the neonatal data is also a further important safety process to have in place.
Sir Robert Buckland.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's difficult to imagine a more horrendous set of crimes than the ones committed by Letby, and her cowardly refusal to attend her sentence added grievous insult to the huge injury and misery she's caused to all the families. Can we put on record our thanks to the trial judge and the jury for the incredible work they did, but also in welcoming my right honourable friend's commitment to a full statutory inquiry under the 05 Act and commending Lady Justice Thirlwell. Will he agree with me that it is important that open justice is maintained so that we fully, and the wider public, can fully understand what on earth happened here? Because this affects not just those families on the indictment or the victims on the indictment, but hundreds of families across the entire region. And open justice has to be at the heart of judicial process.
So first, can I join my right honourable friend in paying tribute to the trial judge and the jury in what must have been a very harrowing case for them to sit and deal with. He makes, as ever, a very important point in terms of open justice. I just have one caveat, which I hope he will forgive me on, which is it's also important we get the balance right in terms of respecting the privacy of families where that is their wish as well, particularly given quite often these families will have other young children who may or may not know about aspects of this case. So it is important we have open justice, but at the heart of our approach is ensuring that we are following the wishes of the family, and that includes respecting privacy where that is appropriate.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's all too tragic, and my prayers are also with the families which have suffered so much over this time. It's 10 years since Robert France's report was published, and of course he put forward the duty of candor, and yet the duty of candor of 7 consultants was ignored and overridden. And as a result of that, will he ensure that there is an independent external route through which concern can be raised? And further to that, will he look at the accountability and scrutiny and supervision of clinicians throughout the health service, because the pressures on the service at the moment often mean that those vital checks are often missed.
Well, again, I agree. It is extremely important that we have the right levels of escalation, the right routes available to those raising concerns. I've already signalled, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the House a number of safeguards that have already been in place following various reviews, including the Francis review. Indeed, I spoke to Sir Robert around the lessons from his report, as I have with a number of other chairs in recent weeks. So it is important. A number of safeguards are already in place, but of course the inquiry will look at how those fit together and whether any further steps are required.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Madam Deputy Speaker,
May I welcome the dashboard that the Secretary of State has announced, which will identify outliers so that they can look at trusts which have abnormal events. But in this particular case, the fact that events were happening unexpectedly was identified, and staffing analysis was done, and 7 consultants raised that this was a problem. They identified Lucy Letby as a potential potentially causing this harm, and they were repeatedly ignored. So we also need to bear in mind that if they had not been ignored, some of these babies might not have died. And that is not good enough. I urge him, as he seeks answers to how it can be prevented, to focus on 3 things. How he can develop clear lines of medical, nursing and managerial accountability. How he can prevent poor managers from moving from trust to trust to evade such accountability, and how, if 7 consultants find themselves in a similar position in the future, they can escalate beyond their trust, outside their trust, to get some attention.
Well, Madam Speaker, there's already a number of steps that have been taken. For example, the role of medical examiners, working in conjunction with the role of the coroner, and these are the sort of areas that the inquiry, I'm sure, we'll look at in terms of the role of the coroner, the role of the medical director, the role of the Royal College report in 2016, and who had sight of that, and what action was taken, the role of the board, including the non-exec lead in terms of issues around patient safety. So there will be a range of areas, which is the whole purpose of having this inquiry. A number of steps have already been put in place, but it is important that we learn the lesson where clinicians have raised concerns and those concerns were not acted on.
Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have co-signed a letter to the Health Secretary from Salford MPs and the Salford City Mayor detailing that 2 senior managers from the Countess of Chester Hospital, who were accused, as we've been discussing, of repeatedly ignoring warnings about Miss Letby's actions, then left that hospital and were employed or seconded to NHS trusts in Greater Manchester, including Salford Royal NHS Foundation Trust and the Northern Care Alliance. The 2 managers were re-employed well after the police had launched their investigation into Lucy Letby, and this does raise serious questions about NHS governance, HR processes, safety, risk assessment and the role of regulators, as already been raised by our front bench and my honourable friend the member for Weaver Vale. I want to join our concerns from Salford with the concerns which the Health Secretary says is already being expressed about these governance issues raised by the re-employment of managers at that time, and ask for assurances that this will be fully explored in Justice Thirlwall's inquiry.
Well, again, I mean, she raises extremely important issues, and I'm happy to give her the assurance that these issues will be explored. It is something that NHS England is looking at in terms of the concerns that have been expressed around the regulation of managers. The Chief Exec of NHS England hosted a meeting last week with key stakeholders discussing these very issues, and of course I will relay to the Chief Exec of NHS England the points that she's raised.
Andrew Salou.
A few years ago, I was a whistleblower myself against an orthopaedic surgeon in my local hospital who was putting the same metal implant into patients' backs, whether they needed it or not. No other hospital was doing it. The specialist hospital only ever took it out. And actually from that work, I was a parliamentary advocate with Tim Briggs for getting it right first time, my constituent. We pushed that for 8 years before the NHS took it up, so I'm pleased to hear the Secretary of State talking about it. But what I discovered then was that the desire of trust management to cover things up, to protect the reputation of their institution, seemed to trump doing the right thing and throwing a spotlight of transparency on what was happening. What are the key reforms that the Secretary of State spoke about today that will mean that will not happen in future, and those brave clinicians who spoke up will be listened to in future cases like this?
So I think the key reforms are things such as the Get It Right First Time and the work that Professor Tim Briggs and I raised with him, the issue around Chester and the fact that his team have been reviewing that data. It is the strengthening of the freedom to speak up guardians, the appointment of a new Patient Safety Commissioner. It is the strengthening of the Public Interest Disclosure Act. It is the role of child death overview panels and the scrutiny that they provide. It is also the expanded role of medical examiners, again, that were not in place. So significant actions have been taken, but it is right through the inquiry that we both look at the specific issues that arose at Chester and also any further steps that are appropriate.
Ben Bradshaw.
When as the former health minister I saw the list of hospitals that the former chief executive of Chester Hospital had gone on to after the Lucy Letby case, it had an eerily familiar ring about it from previous scandals where failed managers had gone on to at least some of exactly the same hospitals. So why is he waiting for another review or for the inquiry before finally closing this revolving door and introducing independent regulation for hospital managers in the same way as medical staff are subjected to?
Well, just to reassure you, it's not that we are waiting. I've already said that NHS England, not least the meeting they had last week, looking at the recommendations on CART that were accepted. And the reason recommendation 5 wasn't was, having discussed it with them, the view at the time was the recommendations accepted were felt to be sufficient in addressing the concern of the revolving door. But it's right that we test that. But also it's right that we get the balance right, because he mentions concerns that certain trusts may be seen as more difficult to manage. And what we don't want to do is create an environment where people are unwilling to go to those more difficult trusts because they fear the risk that they carry. So it's important we get the right support for managers, particularly around some of the more difficult trusts to manage, alongside having the accountability. And of course, getting that detail right requires us to work closely with NHS England and the wider NHS family.
Order, there's a lot of noise in the chamber. I think people have come in for the next piece of business and are forgetting just how very serious and sombre this piece of business is. Have some thought for others. Shailesh Vara.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State has rightly spoken of the enormous pain and suffering of the parents in this horrific case. He will appreciate, however, that during the course of the Lucy Letby trial, they have had to relive all of that pain and suffering. And as the statutory inquiry progresses, that pain will be continuing for months and weeks ahead. Will the Secretary of State give an assurance to the House that in the period ahead, during the course of the inquiry and beyond, these parents will receive all the support that they need to get through this ordeal?
Well, he's absolutely right around the way that the trial actually re-triggered a lot of pain and suffering for the families. But also what I found particularly powerful when talking to them was the fact that they discovered new information during the course of the trial, including harm to their children, that they had not been told hitherto. And that was particularly concerning, and clearly serious lessons needed to be taken in terms of that. In terms of the support, part of the reason for wanting to engage with them at the earliest opportunity was to ensure that we are doing all we can to support them, and that is very central to the way that I understand the judge will look to structure the inquiry to ensure that the wishes of the families are central to the approach that is taken.
Liz Savile-Roberts.
Under Prilevarith. Letby's crimes freeze the heart, and I commend the Secretary of State that this inquiry is to be statutory. And although health is devolved, babies from across North Wales are regularly sent to hospitals in North West England, including the Countess of Chester, for specialist care and treatment. What assurance can he give to Welsh families that the statutory inquiry's terms of reference will include cross-border patient safety and the safety of babies in hospitals, possibly hours away from their families in Wales?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising that. It's an extremely important point, because 5 of the babies concerned in the trial actually were from a cross-jurisdiction basis. So it is important that we take on board those lessons. We look at how those cases where it applies, in this case to a baby or a family from Wales, are captured. And I know that is something that Judge Thur will give consideration to, but will be shaped by her discussions with the families.
Luke Hall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Having a child in neonatal intensive care is absolutely terrifying. As a parent in that situation, you are completely reliant on the professionalism and the compassion of the NHS staff. And that's what makes the crimes of Letby so evil and so unfathomable. None of us can imagine what the families are going through right now, what they will have to relive during the course of this statutory inquiry. So can the Secretary of State give a assurance to the House that the anonymity of the families will be protected if they want it to be so during the course of this inquiry, so that they can have the privacy that they need during this very difficult time?
Well, I absolutely agree with his sentiment to put the families central in their wishes. Of course, I hope he'll understand that as part of an independent inquiry, it will be for the judge to decide which hearings are held in public and which are in private. In essence, part of the discussion initially around a non-statutory inquiry and my discussion with the families were around some of the privacy concerns and the balance of that versus the more adversarial and public nature of a statutory inquiry. But I know that Justice Thurwell will be very sensitive to the wishes of the family and what is the appropriate balance between hearings that are held in public and those that are held in private.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. After all that's happened, it was surely a mistake not to implement Recommendation 5 of the CARC review. So why doesn't the Secretary of State just get on with it and bring it in to disbar senior managers in the NHS?
Well, the recommendations on CARC that were accepted were believed, and these are events since those covered at Chester, are believed to have addressed the concerns in terms of the revolving door. But given the issues that have come to light through the case in Chester, that is why I've asked NHSE colleagues to revisit that decision, not wait for the inquiry to look at that, but of course the inquiry itself will also look at what is the right balance of regulation for managers.
Anna Fuller.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I wholeheartedly welcome the Secretary of State's announcement that there will be a full judge-led statutory inquiry into these horrifying, despicable crimes. It defies belief that senior NHS managers and leaders could have ignored the concerns of senior clinicians in the NHS for so long. And I look forward to the reassurance that this statutory inquiry will not hold back in holding those senior managers to account to make sure this doesn't happen in any hospital ever again. But I also welcome today's update that the Essex NHS mental health inquiry has also moved to a statutory footing. And I welcome the fact that Baroness Lampard will be chairing that inquiry, and I know parents will be reassured that she is in this House listening to members' concerns.
Well, I hope my honourable friend will note the appointment of a Court of Appeal judge underscores the seriousness of the inquiry into the murders by Letby. And in terms of the decision before summer to place the Essex inquiry on a statutory footing, again, that underscores our commitment to getting answers to those families in Essex, particularly where there are concerns that staff hitherto have not engaged with the inquiry in the way that they need to do.
Helen Morgan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My thoughts and prayers and those of my party are with everyone affected by the unspeakably evil crimes of Lucy Letby. Now, in this instance, we have had a serial killer in play, and that makes it unique. But it's clear that there have been management failings, failing to listen to senior clinicians, potentially even a cover-up. And that, unfortunately, is not a new situation for the NHS. As the MP for North Shropshire, I've seen management failings at the Shrewsbury and Talbot Hospital Trust. My colleague for Westmoreland and Lonsdale has highlighted the failings at Morecambe Bay. We have had numerous inquiries into management failures at the NHS. We have said never again so many times, and we are still here. So how can the Secretary of State reassure parents and people who are being, whose lives are being treated in the NHS that this time we will say never again and we will mean it?
Hear, hear. Well, again, I very much agree in terms of the imperative of learning from the various reviews that have taken place. That is why, indeed, I've personally spoken to the chairs of those reviews over recent days and weeks. I would point out that these events took place before a number of the recommendations that were made from those reviews were given to the government, and those recommendations have been implemented, whether that is, as I say, on things like the medical examiner role, whether it's on the strengthening of the Public Interest Disclosure Act, whether it's on the use of Get It Right First Time to review the data, whether it's the freedom to speak up guardians and the new Patient Safety Commissioner role. So significant action has been taken following those reviews, and those actions have been taken since these events. But through the inquiry, we will of course test whether further action is needed.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And as my friends, the member for Chester and the member for Ellesmere Port explained, for those of us whose constituents use the Countess and who work there, this has been the most dreadful time. But only those, Madam Deputy Speaker, who've lost a child could even begin to understand the pain that the families have experienced through this. So it's right that there is unanimity in this House about what is done now. And can I come back to the question asked by my friend, the member for York, about duty of candor? Because 10.5 years ago, I stood here in this House and listened to the now Chancellor talk about duty of candor. So I am at a loss to understand how it could be that families weren't entitled to every bit of information when they asked for it. What review has the Secretary of State already conducted looking into the effectiveness of duty of candor, and what's his conclusion about what has gone wrong over the past 10 years?
Right. Well, as I said previously, significant action has been taken over that 10 years in terms of strengthening the transparency, strengthening the action taken on data, strengthening the freedom to speak up, guardians, ensuring that more safeguards are in place. But part of the purpose of the inquiry is to test whether further action is needed. But I've already asked NHS England to look again at areas where recommendations have been made and what further action we can take.
And finally, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all thank the Secretary of State very much for the tone and the compassion of his answers to all of the questions. I think the Secretary of State is encompassed all of our thoughts and our emotions in a very, very positive way, and thank him for that. Can the Secretary of State confirm that any procedural changes that come from lessons learned in this dreadful case will be shared throughout the trust areas, as a horror that has shaken every parent, every pregnant mother, and indeed every midwife in every corner of this United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, who want to know how they can protect their most vulnerable in their society and our society, and how government can ensure that finances do not preclude precautions being taken to protect babies, but also to protect staff in the wards. And will the inquiry findings be shared with all the devolved administrations? Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, firstly, I'm very happy to commit that the inquiry findings will be shared with administrations across Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It is important that the lessons are learnt. It's also important that we look at where staff move, and that often includes not just within England, but staff moving, including to Northern Ireland. It's also important we look at where patients are in one jurisdiction but may have been treated for a period of time in another. So these are issues that do apply across the United Kingdom. We should have a UK-wide approach, including to data and looking at variation across the United Kingdom, and that's something he will take a very keen interest in.
I thank the Secretary of State